Senior Israeli officers believe that Israel is in social chaos as clashes between anti-Netanyahu protesters and supporters of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the police escalate. For the past few months, the Israeli regime has been preparing for an uprising. Now, demonstrators against Netanyahu are calling for an uprising. This while Netanyahu and his son Yair are accused of inciting the right-wing and far-right-wing supporters to attack what they call leftists seeking an end to Netanyahu's rule. Israel is in a state of chaos, and it seems that things will only escalate. This comes even with the hiring of a new so-called Corona czar, who is tasked with ending the daily protests against Netanyahu's rule. Israelis are now finding themselves desperate for survival, as the coronavirus has led to the collapse of the economy there. For many Israelis, the only solution is to get rid of
Thank you for asking for my response, and I think it's important to ask the protesters because I was arrested half an hour before the time frame in which we were not allowed to protest anymore. I was not told why I was arrested, and I was forced to sign a contract that says I won't come near the Prime Minister's area in Balfour for 2 weeks.
And as things become gloomy, senior officers representing the intelligence, academia, military, and the regime are taking note that things are getting out of hand. Behind closed doors and at an undisclosed location, senior police officers explained to members of the Israeli intelligence, army, and representatives of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet that Israel is in a state of chaos, according to Israel's Channel 12. The meeting came as brutal violence continues to break out between different factions and authorities during anti-regime protests across Israel, but primarily in the capital Tel Aviv. A number of protesters protesting against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in central Tel Aviv were hospitalized. They were attacked by far-right demonstrators who support Netanyahu, reportedly infiltrated the anti-Netanyahu demonstration, attacking a group of protesters with pepper spray and glass bottles. The following is a photograph and a video of that specific attack. The person in the above photograph is 27-year-old Shaya Sekler, and his picture has been circulating on social media in Israel. He claims that when he approached the police to let them know what happened, they just ignored him completely. Opposing factions have been taking weapons, including knives, pepper spray, and glass bottles to protests. There, they begin to attack each other. And according to those injured in such clashes, police are not there to help them, as they are on the side of the regime. Police are being blamed by protesters who say that while they are wary of far-right infiltrators who attack them, go further and say they also fear police who also attack them. Mass demonstrations like this have been going on for months. The protesters are demanding that Netanyahu resign and are also calling for action as people's lives are in jeopardy due to the financial hardships that they are facing.
It's kind of Israel is living in a kind of organized chaos. State functions, we have this corona pandemic and economic collapse, but if you look around the country, life goes on. Even though there are a lot of people unemployed, businesses are still working, the transportation works, we have electricity, not like in Gaza or parts of the West Bank. There's water, the government functions, but everyone has a sense that we're kind of walking on eggs. It's very sensitive. The government is very fragile. Everyone knows that they hate each other from the two main parties, and they're just waiting for this to break down and for us to go to elections for the fourth time. It's just a matter of time. This is what most people feel. Have a very challenged democracy and a difficult political system that requires coalitions to be made between political parties, and Netanyahu, who's a political wizard, has managed over all of these years to create a bloc of loyalists, that he's loyal to them and they're loyal to him. And because the public is very divided on the most key issues, no one gets an absolute majority. So the government is always very fragile, is very small. It's a coalition of mixed parties with different interests. Netanyahu is very strong. He's like Trump. He has a base which supports him regardless of what he does. He can lie, he can cheat, he can steal, he can be indicted for crimes that any other politician in a democracy would automatically resign. I think the #1 challenge to Israel, the existential question for Israel, is the Palestinian issue. Israel claims to be the democratic nation state of the Jewish people, but for 52 years the reality that we have is one state binational apartheid. It's not democracy because 50% of the people living on the land between the river and the sea don't have democracy, and you can't claim that it's the Jewish nation state because 50% of the people living here are not Jewish. So we are essentially lying to ourselves. The failure to make difficult decisions with regard to the Palestinian issue leaves us in a situation where there's no negotiations, there's no leaders, there's no real two-state solution anymore, and no one else has anything to offer. And this is the key question facing Israel. By the way, it's the key question facing the Palestinians.
אנחנו יושבים במאהל הזה מסיבה מאוד מסוימת, ורבים הצטרפו, רבים מסיבות שונות ומגוונות. אנחנו כאן כיוון שאנחנו חושבים שעומד היום בראש המדינה בן אדם מושחת. הוא נאשם בעבירות מאוד חמורות, ולפיכך כאשר הוא עומד בסיטואציה הזאת, כל השיקולים שלו הם כולם אישיים. אין שיקול ענייני אחד בכל ההחלטות שלו. אנחנו רואים את זה שוב ושוב ושוב. והמצב הולך ומחמיר כתוצאה מכך. וכל אחד מאיתנו הגיע מסיבות שלו, אבל בסופו של דבר המחאה שנמצאת כאן כרגע במאהל הזה נובעת רק מהיותו של ראש ממשלה חשוד בעבירות מאוד מאוד חמורות. כל אדם אחר בעל מוסר בסיסי ביותר היה מזמן כבר שם את המפתחות ואומר אני זז הצידה, כיוון שזה לא תקין, במדינה אחרת לא הייתי מסכים שזה יקרה, אבל כיוון שהשיקול שלו כרגע הוא אישי.
אני כבר מפגין מעל 3 שנים. לא פה, התחלנו בפתח תקווה, ששם הפגנו נגד היועץ המשפטי לממשלה, אביחי מנדלבליט, שהתפקיד שלו היה לחקור את ראש הממשלה, והוא לא עשה את עבודתו. הוא גרר רגליים. כן?
אני לא סובל כלכלית, אני פנסיונר, אני מסודר כלכלית, הקורונה לא פגעה בי, שום דבר לא פגע בי. אני התחלתי עוד לפני הקורונה, מה שאני סובל, זה שאני סובל שאני מרגיש שהמדינה הזאת מפסיקה להיות מדינה ליברלית, דמוקרטית, שחיה על פי ערכים. וזה חונק אותי פה. את הנשמה שלי, זה מה שזה חונק, ובשביל זה אני פה. אני פה כי אני לא רוצה שהמשטרה תבוא ותגיד לי אם אני מותר לי להפגין ככה, אסור לי להפגין ככה. אנחנו עכשיו מפגינים כנגד כל השחיתות השלטונית הזאת. וזה מפריע לי פה, מעבר לזה לא מפריע לי.
Social media, this topic made waves. According to Neri, Israel's Corona czar says he has considered quitting 5 weeks after Netanyahu appointed him. According to Anshel Peffer, Netanyahu has realized that he can't regain the public's trust on coronavirus, which is why he finally agreed to appoint a Corona czar and is now trying to shift the blame onto him. Arya says that the crisis since May has been a result as much as anything of Netanyahu's political weakness. His instincts on the virus are good, but he isn't strong enough to get stuff through cabinet anymore. Avi says that for someone who is supposed to communicate to the entire Israeli public, he is doing a really poor job.
Israel is currently in a stalemate because it's unlikely either to cut taxes or either to increase taxes or to cut spending. And while various American publications predict that Netanyahu is clinging to power in order to reach a better plea bargain, in fact, they don't know Netanyahu. He's likely to stick to power because he believes it's his rightful place, and he's unlikely to budge even a little bit. And he's likely to drag the country in a prolonged crisis for foreseeable future, unless he happens to have some kind of health problem. He's likely to continue in his adamant position, meanwhile leaving the country in a standstill. And basically, right now we have a caregiver government, and this caregiver government is probably not going away anytime soon. And in any case, it's not. It has an inability to take the country out of its current position of a stalemate and to offer a vision forward.
ניקיון מוחלט של מדינת ישראל מהשחיתות השלטונית הבזויה שפושעת בכל מקום, ואנחנו לא ניתן לה לנצח אותנו. לא ניתן! לא ניתן! לא ניתן! לא ניתן! לא ניתן! חוזה חדש! חוזה חדש! חוזה תנו כבוד לשי שבא אחרי ששיגעתי אותו המון זמן. שי, מי שבא אחרי הרבה זמן, הפדיחה שלו זה שאני אותו.
Different sectors of the economy have threatened to reject rules imposed at the last minute by the regime, including closures. At one point, restaurant owners forced Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to back down from an order to close restaurants in August. Demonstrations in occupied Jerusalem, Al-Quds, and Tel Aviv are being conducted because they see Netanyahu as the enemy of the people and feel that Israel is spinning out of control. The demonstrations were triggered by the political deadlock, the coronavirus pandemic, and the slow response, and what demonstrators perceive as the failed response by the regime. These protesters view Netanyahu's clinging to power as support for his right-wing alliance, who are in turn attacking them. Throughout the summer, thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets, calling for Netanyahu to resign, protesting his handling of the coronavirus crisis, and saying he should not remain in office while on trial for corruption charges. Though Netanyahu has tried to play down the protests, the twice-a-week gatherings show no signs of slowing. On the contrary, they are growing. The rallies against Netanyahu are the largest social movements Israel has seen since 2011 protests over Israel's high cost of living. Protesters have clashed with the police, accusing them of using excessive force. This while gangs of Netanyahu supporters affiliated with a far-right group have assaulted demonstrators. Netanyahu has claimed demonstrators are inciting violence against him. Protesters want Netanyahu to be tried and hanged, they say. The situation has gotten out of control.
Demonstrations against Netanyahu unfortunately, are not about the occupation and the Palestinian issue. They're about the failings of our democracy. The fact that we have a prime minister who's been indicted with 3 charges of corruption and breaking the public trust, and he doesn't step down. He continues to be in government, and this is a sign of corruption of our government. We have a decreasing freedoms of our democratic institutions, and Netanyahu, because of his attempt to stay out of court, is compromising the watchdogs of our democracy, is challenging all the time the legitimacy of the courts, of the prosecutor, of the attorney general, of the police. He has claimed that these charges against him are fabricated. He echoes Trump in talking about a deep state, and he delegitimizes our media. Just like Trump. It's a mirror image of Trump, exactly one-to-one. And now he even is calling the demonstrators anarchist, just as Trump called the demonstrators for Black Lives Matter as anarchist. There's not much of a gap. It's a personality gap. It's on the issue of Gantz is the Minister of Defense now. There's no difference at all in the policies between Gantz and Netanyahu in regard to the Ministry of Defense. There are issues between Gantz and Netanyahu on what we call clean politics. And Gantz is probably more honest. He's not a liar, a pathological liar like Netanyahu. He's not a thief and he's not corrupt. So the issues are about this, the differences between Netanyahu and Gantz. But Netanyahu has charisma. Netanyahu is a sly fox politician. And Gantz is a newborn politician who doesn't understand politics, has no charisma, and he doesn't understand how politics work. I think that the first thing that has to happen is that we have to get rid of Netanyahu. He has such a strong grip on the society, on the politics, that nothing can change until he's out of the picture. And once he's out of the picture, a space opens up for change. A space opens up for people to recognize that Netanyahu is not the only person who can lead this country. But our problem is not just Netanyahu the man. Our problem is Netanyahu the regime. And we need a regime change here. We need to reform our political system. We might need to reform our electoral system, the way that we elect our government, because we've been in a stalemate for too long. And hopefully, if and when those things happen, new leaders will also stand up. We need to see the young generation stand up. People who can challenge the society with new ideas and new proposals and new thinking. We need new thinking. The old paradigms, the old slogans don't work anymore. They don't hold water. They
ביבי נתניהו לכלא מסיהו! ביבי נתניהו לכלא מסיהו! ביבי נתניהו לכלא מסיהו!
קודם כל אני חוזר ואומר, שום דבר לא יבוא לידי ביצוע עד אשר השיקול יהפוך לשיקול ענייני. יש מינו עכשיו פרויקטור חדש לטיפול בנושא הקורונה, אבל עדיין השיקולים הפוליטיים מעורבבים שם, ורואים מתקפה גדולה מאוד של חלק משרי הקואליציה על פרופסור גמזו, כך שבעצם הוא לא יכול למלא תפקידו כמו שצריך. אנחנו מחכים שמישהו רציני יבוא וישים את הדברים האלה בצד, הפוליטיקאים יפנו את המקום ויאפשרו למי שצריך לטפל במצב לעשות את זה כמו שצריך.
היה אירוע לפני כבר יותר מ3 שנים, שקבוצה קטנה מאוד של מפגינים עם בן אדם בשם מני נפתלי, שהיה אב הבית של ביבי, כן? ואז הוא עזב את התפקיד והתחיל לדבר נגד מה שקורה כאן בבית.
אני ליאיר נתניהו לא רוצה להתייחס, הוא לא שווה אף מילה שאני אגיד סגור.
Online, this topic is being talked about. Elizabeth says that at protest sites, participants often engage in dialogue with each other, allowing the non-Zionist contingent to reach a new audience. Protesters also undergo a process of radicalization due to police violence against them, as well as incitement against them by Netanyahu and minions. Market Marvel says opposing Netanyahu's policies doesn't make one anti-Israel. His policies look more like Nazi Germany than Israel. Eaton says that this is the 10th straight week of national anti-Netanyahu protests. Despite momentum, these demos are only a beginning. As one activist told me, even if Netanyahu leaves, we'll need time to rebuild the institutions he destroyed. Royce says that it sounds like they're protesting more so because he's corrupt and less so because he's a fascist. He feels that the latter is better cause for outrage. Mantha replies, a bit of both actually, with one causing the other. Netanyahu has so far dismissed the demands of the demonstrators. Recently, his right-wing Likud party issued a statement that accused Israel's only 2 private TV stations of giving free and endless publicity to the protesters and exaggerating the importance of the gatherings.
Well, everything comes back to Bibi Netanyahu, who is in the fight for his political life with these last 3 elections and the third one, which created this unity government. And so he was not above exploiting COVID-19 to show Israel that he was a strong leader, that he was going to help, he was going to bring all of Israel out of the COVID-19 threat, and he was going to do it personally. So that he could, secure votes and he could make himself look like the indispensable leader, which is really characteristic of a more authoritarian kind of regime. It turns out that Netanyahu had very little impact on what happened with COVID-19. It was all done as the way good countries responding to it should have done through health authorities, public health authorities. The ministers always in Israel are exploiting the optimal amount that they can milk events for in terms of their popularity. And Netanyahu is really a master in that.
In a nearly 6-minute rant at a meeting of his cabinet, Netanyahu slammed the media for inflaming the protests, that is, devoting disproportionate airtime to them, and for distorting incidents of violence against the protesters. For months now, the regime in Tel Aviv has been anticipating social chaos or even an uprising against the regime. Back in late April, a team from the National Security Council, tasked with combating the coronavirus outbreak, discussed an armed revolt scenario caused by the economic crisis. The 30-member team that brought together regime officials, analysts, and representatives from the Israeli army, the NSC, police, and academia reportedly discussed the circumstances that may lead to such a civil uprising alongside ways to suppress it. The team claimed that distress and anger will not lead to large-scale social phenomena on their own, at least in the short term. The second scenario, however, holds the potential to cause substantial long-term damage to Israeli society and democracy. The regime is taking note that its grip on power is eroding by
ההפגנות הולכות ומתרחבות, הולכות ומתעצמות.
יום היסטורי למחאה בישראל.
שורה ארוכה של הפגנות שאני לא זוכר את הכמות שלהן מאז שהחלה המחאה הזאת לפני כמה חודשים.
אירוע ההפגנות והמחאה הגדול ביותר מאז החלה המחאה הזאת.
אזרחים רבים שמעולם לא יצאו מבתיהם יוצאים עכשיו החוצה להפגין.
עשינו חיבור עם כל היישובים של קריית אונו כדי להוציא את האנשים קרוב לבית.
לא רצית אותנו בבלפור, תקבל אותנו בבת ים.
אנחנו ראינו למעלה מ-200,000 איש שיצאו לרחובות ישראל.
אין לנו ארץ אחרת.
תראו כמה אנשים, יא אללה.
לא ניתן לכם להפוך אותנו לדיקטטורה.
הצעירים האלה, זה לא רק שהרגו להם את הפרנסה, הרגו להם את העתיד, וזו הסיבה שהם נמצאים ברחובות.
הישג אזרחי מדהים, ובעצם המחאה הזאת רק הולכת ומתעצמת. אז אתם רואים שזה גם הכוח של הצעירים, אבל לא רק, גם הכוח של המבוגרים יותר, גם הכוח של המבוגרים יותר, של ההורים לילדים, של הסבים, של הסבתות, כולם בסיפור הזה. זה לא ייגמר עד שהוא יתפטר. המחאה הזאת פשוט מוכיחה שהיא כאן כדי לנצח.
זוכרת מה היה כקריקטור.
כבוד ההפגנה שממשיכים.
לא. ביבי אשם.
שופר! על מי אתה שומר? חברים, אנחנו חייבים שהוא יעצר! אני מבקשת מכולכם שהוא יעצר! הוא הרביץ לשתי נשים, תאמרו למשטרה!
שוטרים, הוא הרביץ לעבורכם! שוטרים, אתם מבינים ומושחתים והגנבים לא תשים! תתבייש! בגבך.
ולך, עורך דין מנדלבליט, חברם של ניר חפץ, נתניהו ועוד כמה עבריינים בדרך, בהווה, בעתיד. לך, עורך דין מנדלבליט, שומר הסף הראשי של שלטון החוק בישראל, שומר שרוממות המקצועיות בלשונו, אך מעשיו עד כה, דבריו, לרבות בימים האחרונים, ובוודאי ההדלפות היוצאות מקרבתו, מזכירים דווקא סנגור משפחתי ולא תובע לאומי. לך, עורך דין מנדלבליט, וצמד הסנצ'ו פנצ'ו שלו, ניצן ורז נזרי. רז נצרי.